Here we have the sagittal view of the brain, which is my personal favorite. So starting with the anterior portion, we have the frontal lobe. This area, this lobe, will conclude with the precentral gyrus, right here. The precentral gyrus houses the primary motor cortex and is largely responsible for control of voluntary motor movement. We then have the central sulcus, followed by the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus houses our somatosensory cortex, which allows us to feel things like pain and touch. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe, which can be seen here. The parietal lobe ends with the parietal occipital sulcus. Rightfully named, this sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. This is our occipital lobe here. One last lobe we can see from this view is the temporal lobe, which can be seen right down there. The temporal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by the lateral fissure, but we cannot see that in this view. Let's take a look at the cerebellum. This bilateral structure sits inferior and posterior to the cerebrum. Here. There are two hemispheres, the right and left cerebellar hemispheres. This would be our right cerebellar hemispheres. These white lines shown here are the Arbor Vitae. This is the cerebellar white matter. The name means tree of life in Latin due to its tree-like appearance. Again, the Arbor Vitae in the cerebellum. Moving towards the center of the brain, we now have the corpus callosum. That is this white structure here. This white structure connects the right and left hemispheres, allowing for communication between the two sides of our brain. One way to remember this is that the corpse is laying on top of the diencephalon. The corpus callosum has two regions. The genu is the anterior portion, and we can remember this because the genius sits in the front. Going posteriorly, we have the splenium, which is the posterior part of the corpus callosum. Going down from the corpus callosum, we then have our septum pellucidum. That is this area here. This is a thin membrane that separates the lateral ventricles. We will now go over the diencephalon. That is this area. This structure resembles a bird, so I'm going to reference the bird to help with retention. To start, we have the fornix, which is this white area here. We can also call this the mohawk on top of the bird's head, the fornix right here. We then have the thalamus, which would be the bird's head, the thalamus. We have the intermediate mass, which could be called the bird's eyeball, right in the middle of the thalamus. So the intermediate mass with the thalamus. Then going posteriorly, we have what we like to call our bird's man bun. This right here is our pineal body. This pineal body releases melatonin. Headed anteriorly past the thalamus, we then have the hypothalamus. This area here could be called our bird's beak, our hypothalamus. Headed anterior and inferior, we have the infundibulum, which we're going to switch models to be able to see a better view of. So again, headed anterior and inferior from the hypothalamus, we have the infundibulum. That's this portion here, which then leads to the pituitary gland. So we have the pituitary gland and the infundibulum. I like to remember this as if the bird is carrying a cherry, the pituitary gland being the cherry, and the stem of the cherry being the infundibulum. We are going to now move back to the other model. Again, we have our hypothalamus here, and tucked underneath the bird's head and beak, we have the mammillary body. That is this bump right there, the mammillary body. Moving down, we now approach the brainstem, which will be this whole area here. To start, we have the midbrain, which is the most superior portion of the brainstem. Again, this area. The posterior part of the midbrain is the Corpora Quadrigemina, which consists of 4 bumps, 2 of which can be seen here. These are broken into pairs with the superior colliculi and then the inferior colliculi. Both of these deal with vision. The superior colliculi deals with eye tracking and movement, and the inferior colliculi deals with us moving our eyes when we hear a sudden sound. Continuing down the brainstem, we have this large belly here. This is called the pons. Progressing further down, we then have the medulla oblongata, which will then eventually turn into the spinal cord as it travels down our back. In this sagittal view, we can observe the ventricles of the brain. The third ventricle would be this space here in the diencephalon with the thalamus right here. The third ventricle. We can then see the cerebral aqueduct flowing down from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. This fourth ventricle here is found between the pons and the cerebellum. Fourth ventricle is this space here. One way that I like to study the sagittal view of the brain is to Google MRI pictures of it. And that way I just pull up the MRI from Google and I try to name as many structures as I can. And it's a really good way to test yourself and study it and see a new view of the brain that we don't necessarily always get to see in lab.